Welcome to the DES Pharma podcast, where we decode regulatory shifts, review pharma news, and talk pharma technical operations. I'm your host, Mead Meadow, professional engineer, and today I'm with Matt and Isaac. I'd like to announce that DES Pharma will be attending DCAT week in March. DCAT is in New York City and is the premier event for global biopharmaceutical business ecosystem development. So today we'll be discussing tariffs, which we covered in a recent podcast and blog post. So allow me to introduce Matthew Pontrelli, who is a senior consultant with our PD and CMC service, and Isaac Janganathan, our supply chain and procurement lead. Quick disclaimer, this is not regulatory or legal advice. Always consult with your own advisors and engage the FDA directly for your specific program's needs. So we're going to start off with basically an overview of what the U.S. tariff mechanisms are at this time. So Isaac, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Sure. So traditionally, we see that the U.S. has engaged four primary levers for imposing duties and tariffs. So the first, the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, in a nutshell, gave the president very, very broad authority to regulate trade under the premise that it was a national emergency and national security risk. So it was under the IEEPA Act that Trump employed a lot of these tariffs that are in the spotlight. Second lever is Section 232, Trade Expansion Act of 1962, and this authorizes tariffs where the Department of Commerce determines that certain imports may pose a threat to U.S. national security. So those are the Section 2 tariffs. Thirdly, we have the Section 301 tariffs, and these tariffs are more China-specific. For pharmaceuticals, they cover APIs, chemical intermediates, but again, these are primarily for China-specific type tariffs. So that's Section 301. And finally, we have the USMCA, which is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
So how does the IEEPA and USMCA interplay? Matt, if you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I got to say it's a nice breath of fresh air to be on this side of the podcast instead of hosting. So your question, what were the tariff mechanisms in 2025, specifically talking about the IEEPA and USMCA? So I really liked this question because it was a really interesting way that tariffs mechanisms worked in 2025 versus other agreements. So the IEEPA was essentially the tariff mechanism for reciprocal tariffs. It was used for aggressively attacking fentanyl trade from Canada and US. And then what really came into play was the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which shielded APIs and other finished pharmaceutical products to come into the US tariff-free. So if you had a pharmaceutical product or API that was made in Mexico or Canada, you could just, escape the IEPA tariffs altogether. And what sort of may have been happening was companies were trying to move these products over to Mexico or Canada and try to stamp them with some sort of processing step that, gave it a final manufactured certificate from Canada or Mexico so that it could avoid the IEPA tariffs. But this got pretty much thrown out because the regulatory agencies were able to then sort of check in and make sure that if it did have these certificates of made in Mexico and Canada, that it was covered by the USMCA.
Okay, so we're moving on to the next topic, which is the recent Supreme Court decision on the IEEPA and what the outcome was and how it affects all these interplays moving forward. I'm going to give that to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Last Friday, we had a pretty monumental decision by the Supreme Court that essentially said the IEEPA tariffs were no longer valid, that pretty much all the tariffs that were implemented in 2025 were null. It seems that the White House was ready for this because they had ready to go Section 122 of the Trade Act ready to go to implement 10% tariffs right after, and it's looking that they have the ability to move it up to 15%. So that tariff is now being employed, it does have a limit. So these tariffs are limited to 150 days unless Congress acts on it. And, with respect to your question, how that changed, IEPA. So now pretty much the pharma industry does not have to worry about reciprocal tariffs. And now that we're really seeing that it's going to be Section 232, and after the investigation is complete to enact those tariffs on pharmaceutical products, that we're going to see, future tariffs coming on to pharma products. While the IEPA is no longer there, the USMCA is still there. So that's going to still be able to shield against Section 232, be able to shield against Section 122, which is interesting, and I'd like to see that interplay continue. But moving forward, we should see, I would expect something else coming after the 150 days, because the White House was so ready after the Supreme Court ruling to roll out something instantly.
Yeah, can you speak about Section 232 tariffs and the current state of the pharmaceutical investigations that Matt just described, Isaac?
Thanks, Matt, for bringing that point up. I think Section 232, I think it is very important. I think we do need to keep in mind that the investigation is ongoing, right? So the Section 232, we first heard about them in Trump administration #1, and it carried through. It carried through the Biden administration. It's carrying through now under the current administration. And under Section 232, since that investigation is ongoing, I think the pharma industry in particular kind of got a little bit of a shield, a little bit of a pass, meaning you saw the Section 232 have much higher impact on luxury goods, fashions, automobile parts, metals, and the pharma industry. I think BCG had a really good presentation on this. The pharma industry received relatively blanketed or cushioned tariffs, and it was way more on the lower side than some of these other products that I mentioned. And so I think what's important to note now is the investigation is still ongoing. And is there a threat in the increasing of the tariffs on the pharma supplies? I think that the potential is there because it is so small. But again, I think it's one of those wait and see type.
Yeah, makes sense. So to wrap this up, can we talk about some examples of manufacturing pricing deals and how companies are getting these tariff exemptions? Matt, you could take that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think what you're talking about is the deals that large pharmaceutical companies have signed with the government to provide what I would describe as 3-year holidays or tariff holidays. So these are carve-outs specifically tailored towards Section 232, which is the current tariff mechanism that's going to be employed on pharmaceutical products, and in a wide-ranging way. And that, there's an investigation ongoing right now to figure out how the breadth and the extent of the tariffs, what percentage they're going to be. But in the meantime, to sort of reshore manufacturing, Trump has been making deals, and these are usually based off of a substantial U.S. capital investment, or putting their products on Trump RX, the government's platform for direct-to-consumer pharmaceuticals, or most favored nation pricing. So if the companies are complying with sort of government pressure, they're getting a nice little pass. Being able to navigate through a very, very changing period of time where there's going to be tariff percentage changing, different mechanisms being employed, and pretty much with the consistency in which the White House is going about this, that certainty is going to be very helpful. But I'd also like to take a side note that, the companies that are signing these deals are very, very large pharmaceutical companies. So if you're small or medium pharma up to probably a pretty large market cap, you're not really accessing these carve-outs, or at least we haven't seen that yet. So it's going to be interesting to see how 2026 proceeds, to see if there's these small, medium, or even large, medium size companies that are going to be able to navigate the same pathways that large pharma has. So thank you for that question. That was a lot of fun to answer that one.
That'll be all for this podcast, and tune back in next week for our next topic. And everybody have a good evening.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.